A quiet autumn morning in 2004 began with an unusual disturbance on a small street in the suburbs of Albany, New York. Two Ulster County Sheriff's Office vehicles quietly pulled up in front of a modest wooden house where Leonard Whitaker had lived for many decades. Neighbors peeked through curtains as investigators stepped out and positioned themselves around the entrance to the house. Inside, Leonard Whitaker, in his 80s, was preparing his morning coffee routine he had maintained for many years since retiring and living a quiet life after decades working in engineering. A rapid knock sounded early that morning. Leonard Whitaker, Ulster County Sheriff's Office. "We need to speak with you about Margaret Whitaker and the hike at Minnewaska State Park in 1948. Investigators later recalled that the old man's hand paused slightly on the coffee cup when he heard that name, and in that moment, a story that had seemed buried for more than half a century began to resurface. Some names and details in the story have been changed to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. Minnewaska State Park Preserve, located in Ulster County, New York, is a vast nature preserve famous for its high cliffs, dense forests, and trails leading to panoramic views of the Hudson Valley. In late September 1948, as autumn began painting the Shawangunk Mountains red, the park attracted many visitors for hiking and sightseeing. Among those who arrived there on September 29, 1948, was Margaret Whitaker, an ophthalmologist working in the city of Albany. Margaret was known in the local medical community as someone with a stable career who often spent her free time on outdoor excursions. Accompanying her on that day's trip was her husband, Leonard Whitaker. The two left Albany in the morning and drove south to Ulster County, a journey lasting several hours through rural New York roads before reaching the park area in the early afternoon. Upon arrival, their car was seen parked at the trailhead area, where visitors began hiking roads leading to the park's higher points. Some other hikers present in the area later stated they saw Margaret and Leonard walking together up the Gertrude's Nose Trail, a path leading to a cliff area overlooking the valley below. These witnesses noted that the two were moving together in the same direction along the trail, with no unusual signs at that time. However, by mid-afternoon, Leonard Whitaker was seen returning to the parking area without Margaret. According to Leonard, while the two were walking on the trail, Margaret was a short distance behind him, and when he turned back, he could no longer see her. After returning to the trailhead, Leonard said he did not know where Margaret had gone and could not find her on the trail. He walked along the area near the trailhead and around the trail entrance for a short time searching, but found no trace indicating Margaret had returned to the area. Leonard then went to the park ranger station in the preserve to report that his wife had disappeared while hiking on the trail. News that Margaret had not returned with Leonard quickly reached her family in Albany. Upon learning that Margaret could not be found in the park area, the family began contacting law enforcement to officially report Margaret Whitaker as missing. The Ulster County Sheriff's Office accepted the missing person report concerning Margaret Whitaker and opened a case file following standard investigative procedures for an individual believed missing. In a mountainous, forested area, the initial file was established with basic victim information including identity, occupation, residence in Albany, and the location where she was last seen in the Minnewaska State Park Preserve area. Investigators began gathering initial information from Leonard Whitaker, who had accompanied the victim on the September 29, 1948 hike. Leonard provided an account of the day's movements, including when they left Albany in the morning, the driving route toward Ulster County, and when they arrived at the park area in the early afternoon. He stated that after parking at the trailhead, the two began walking on the Gertrude's Nose Trail, with Margaret moving behind him on the path. According to Leonard, at some point during the walk, he realized he no longer saw Margaret behind him, and after turning back to search the section of trail they had just passed without finding her, he returned to the parking area and then went to the park ranger station to report being unable to find his wife. Alongside recording Leonard Whitaker's statement, investigators also collected information from the park ranger on duty in the park that afternoon. The ranger confirmed the time Leonard arrived at the station and reported that Margaret was no longer behind him on the trail. The ranger also provided a description of Leonard's condition upon arrival, as well as the estimated time between when Leonard returned to the trailhead and when he reached the management station to report the incident. At the same time, deputies were sent to the trailhead area to contact other hikers present in the park during the period when Margaret was believed to have gone missing. Some hikers confirmed seeing Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker on the Gertrude's Nose Trail earlier that afternoon, providing information about the two's relative positions on the trail and their direction of travel. These statements were recorded and compared to determine the victim's last seen position, entered into the investigation file as last known position, or LKP. This position was marked on the park map at the trail section, where witnesses confirmed seeing Margaret and Leonard heading toward the cliff area above the trail. In addition to identifying the LKP, investigators also recorded key time points on September 29, 1948. The time Leonard Whitaker left the trail and returned to the trailhead was documented based on his statement, as well as observations from witnesses in the parking area. The time Leonard arrived at the park ranger station to report being unable to find Margaret was also precisely recorded from the on-duty ranger's information. Additionally, the time the two arrived at the park was estimated based on Leonard's statement and records at the park entrance area. All these time points were used to construct a preliminary timeline for September 29, 1948, including the period when the two arrived at the park, began hiking on Gertrude's Nose Trail, the time Margaret was last seen by hikers, and the time Leonard returned to the parking area without her. This preliminary timeline allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events during the period when Margaret Whitaker was believed to have gone missing in the park area. Based on the LKP position and the established time points, deputies and park rangers began determining the initial search area around the trail section where Margaret was last seen. This area included the main trail section, smaller paths branching to other trails, and forested areas immediately adjacent to the trail. Investigators conducted a direct survey of this area, observing the trail's surface for signs that the victim may have left the main path. At the same time, they checked intersections between hiking trails near the LKP to determine whether Margaret might have turned in a different direction while moving. The initial survey also included observing the surrounding terrain, including areas with steep slopes, dense forest sections right beside the trail, and positions where a hiker could slip if losing balance. Based on the last known position identified on Gertrude's Nose Trail, investigators from the Ulster County Sheriff's Office, together with park rangers, began detailed terrain analysis around this area to determine a reasonable search radius. The topographic map of Minnewaska State Park Preserve was spread out at the ranger station, and deputies marked the LKP position on the map, then observed surrounding natural features including the main trail, side trail branches, forested slopes, and the characteristic cliff areas of the Shawangunk Ridge. The Gertrude's Nose area is famous for its high cliffs overlooking the valley below, along with numerous rock crevices and steep forested slopes. Investigators determined that these terrain features could create high-risk areas for a hiker if they left the main trail. From the terrain analysis, they began identifying priority high-risk areas to check first, including steep cliff sections near the trail, deep rock crevices along the mountainside, and steep forested areas where a person could slide if losing balance. These points were marked on the map as locations with high accident potential within the area around the LKP. After identifying the risk areas, investigators established a search perimeter, or initial search boundary, based on the distance a hiker could travel in the time from when Margaret Whitaker was last seen until Leonard Whitaker returned to the trailhead area. This analysis was performed by comparing the previously constructed timeline with the average walking speed of a person on mountainous terrain. From this, deputies determined a search circle surrounding the LKP, with a radius large enough to cover all directions the victim could have gone in that time frame. This search area included the Gertrude's Nose Trail section, where Margaret was last seen, nearby intersecting trail branches, forested slopes below the cliffs, and dense forest areas between hiking routes. Once the search area was defined, it was divided into multiple search sectors, so search teams could check systematically. Each sector was marked on a map with natural boundary lines such as trail segments, forest edges, cliffs, or easily recognizable terrain features. Dividing the area into sectors allowed search forces to assign clear tasks and avoid missing areas between teams. Investigators then planned separate searches for each sector based on its terrain characteristics. Sectors along the trail were assigned to deputies and rangers to walk and check each trail segment for traces such as footprints, personal items, or signs someone had left the trail. Sectors on forested slopes were planned for line sweeps, with team members spaced at set intervals to observe the ground and vegetation. Sectors near cliffs or rock crevices were flagged as areas requiring more cautious access due to rugged terrain and high accident potential. During planning, the Ulster County Sheriff's Office closely coordinated with park rangers of Minnewaska State Park Preserve, who were familiar with the area's complex terrain. Rangers provided information on lesser-known access paths, unofficial trail segments, and cliff positions where visitors often stopped to view the landscape. The Ulster County Sheriff's Office began deploying a large-scale field search operation to check the entire area around Gertrude's Nose Trail, where Margaret Whitaker was last seen. Due to the expansive terrain of Minnewaska State Park Preserve, which includes many rocky slopes and dense forests, the sheriff's office decided to request assistance from the New York State Police. Troopers were dispatched to the park to coordinate with Ulster County deputies and park rangers on duty at the preserve. In addition to law enforcement, local rescue teams familiar with Shawangunk Ridge terrain were also mobilized. These rescue teams regularly operated in the area and had experience navigating steep rocky terrain and dense forests characteristic of Ulster County. News of the search for a missing person in the park quickly spread to nearby communities, leading to participation by many local volunteers. These individuals were gathered at the trailhead area, where deputies and park rangers briefed them on search procedures and guided safe movement in the woods. After teams were formed, search forces began deployment according to the previously planned search grid. This method required each team to move in a horizontal line across each search sector to ensure systematic coverage. Team members were spaced at set intervals to clearly observe the ground and vegetation ahead while moving. The first groups were assigned to check along the Gertrude's Nose Trail. Deputies and troopers walked the trail, observing the ground surface, trail edges, and sections where bushes were disturbed to determine if there were signs someone had left the trail. Positions where the trail intersected other trail branches were also carefully checked to rule out the possibility the victim turned in a different direction. While teams on the trail focused on checking each segment, other groups moved into forested areas near the main route. These forests had significant slopes and thick vegetation limiting visibility. Search teams moved in line sweeps, each person observing the ground ahead for unusual signs such as personal items, tracks in leaf litter, or broken branches. Movement through the forest was slow and controlled to ensure every part of the sector was thoroughly checked. Forested areas between hiking routes were also included in the inspection plan to rule out the possibility the victim left the trail and wandered into less traveled areas. Beyond nearby forests, sectors along the cliff edges of the Shawangunk Ridge were identified as areas requiring cautious checking. Park rangers familiar with the terrain led teams to approach cliff overlooks where visitors often stopped to view the valley below. From these positions, search teams looked down the slopes below to identify signs of landslides, broken trees, or any traces suggesting someone may have fallen from the cliff edge. Some areas with deep crevices or natural rock hollows were checked from above before rescue team members approached closer for direct observation. Cliff area checks were conducted slowly with guidance from those familiar with the terrain to minimize accident risk to search personnel. Throughout the operation, deputies maintained communication between teams through predetermined rally points in the search plan. When a sector completed inspection, information about that area was recorded and marked on the scene map. While search teams continued sweeping each search sector along Gertrude's Nose Trail, a group of deputies and a park ranger responsible for a trail section not far from the last known position discovered an object lying close to the trail edge. The object was a light-colored handkerchief on the layer of dry leaves, just a few steps from the main path, right where vegetation began thickening and leading down a forested slope. Recognizing the object might be related to the missing person, the search group immediately stopped to observe the surrounding scene before approaching. A deputy moved closer and made a preliminary check, noting the handkerchief matched the type described by Margaret Whitaker's family in the initial information provided to police. The discovery of this object right on the trail led investigators to assess that this area could be a key point in the victim's final movements. Following scene handling procedure, team members quickly marked the discovery location with temporary wooden stakes and marking tape to prevent others from accidentally stepping into an area that might contain important evidence. A deputy recorded the precise location of the evidence by measuring the distance from the nearest trail curve and marking the point on the scene map established in the search plan. Information about this find was relayed to the investigative group coordinating activities at the trailhead. Shortly afterward, scene investigators arrived at the handkerchief discovery site to observe directly before proceeding with collection. After a quick check of the surrounding area to ensure no further disturbance, the handkerchief was carefully picked up with gloved hands and placed into an evidence bag. This bag was then temporarily sealed and labeled with the discovery location and collection time for inclusion in the case file. Accurately recording the handkerchief's position allowed investigators to add an important new point to the search map, helping determine Margaret Whitaker's possible range of movement after leaving the trail section where she was last seen. After the evidence was collected, deputies continued examining the ground surface around the area where the handkerchief was found. While observing the soft soil near the trail edge, a park ranger spotted a fairly clear series of shoe prints on the damp ground. These prints were only a few feet from the handkerchief location and extended along the trail edge. Recognizing these as potentially important traces, investigators immediately marked each print with small stakes to avoid accidentally stepping on and distorting their shape. The soil in this area was softer than other trail sections due to the damp layer under dense tree cover, preserving the prints clearly. Deputies began closely observing the series of footprints, noting the distance between steps and the direction they led. To determine whether these prints could belong to Margaret Whitaker, investigators compared the print size with information about the hiking shoes the victim was reported to have worn on the trip. Information about the shoe type and size had been recorded from family statements in the initial file. A deputy used a measuring tape to measure the length and width of the prints in the soft soil, then recorded these measurements in the scene notebook. The obtained measurements showed the print size fell within the compatible range for Margaret Whitaker's shoe size. Beyond size, investigators also observed the sole pattern imprinted in the soil, including grooves and distinctive treads. These features were carefully noted for later comparison with the specific description of the shoes the victim wore when leaving Albany that morning. After completing documentation of the footprints, deputies began observing the direction of travel indicated by the series of prints on the ground. From this information, the deputies of the Ulster County Sheriff's Office, along with park rangers, decided to shift the focus of the survey to the cliff area near that trail section. These areas run along the slopes of the Shallangunk Ridge, where many trail segments run close to the edge of the mountainside and offer broad views down to the valley below. Search teams began checking the cliff area near the trail by moving slowly along the path, observing sections where hikers might step close to the edge of the steep slope. Park rangers accompanying the group pointed out that at some positions on this route, the distance from the trail to the cliff edge was only a few steps, especially at points where visitors often stopped to view the landscape. Such positions were considered areas needing more thorough inspection because they could create a risk of slipping for hikers if they stepped too close to the rock edge. Deputies began assessing the possibility of a slip at each point along the trail section near the cliffs. They observed the trail surface structure, including the thin layer of soil over rock and sections where the path sloped slightly toward the steep drop. Some spots showed exposed rocks right on the trail, while the overlying soil was quite thin and could become slippery if damp or covered with dry leaves. Investigators checked these areas to determine whether a person walking could lose balance when stepping onto those rock surfaces. In addition to observing the trail surface, deputies also paid attention to the low bushes growing along the mountainside edge. These bushes could act as a natural barrier, but if someone slipped off the trail, they could also be broken or pulled aside. Search team members bent down to inspect bushes near the cliff edge for unusual signs such as broken branches, pulled down leaves, or disturbed soil. Such signs could indicate the spot where a person abruptly left the trail. While some deputies focused on observing the trail edge, others moved closer to the cliff edge to look downward. They stood at a safe distance from the edge and looked down the slope below to assess the terrain. Some cliff sections led to forested slopes where a person might slide down but be stopped by trees or large rocks. Other sections were sheer vertical rock faces extending downward, where a slip could result in falling to much lower areas than the trail position. Observing from above allowed investigators to evaluate where a person slipping off the trail edge might stop on the slope or continue falling farther down. Park rangers accompanying the search continued to point out spots along the mountainside where visitors commonly stood to enjoy the view. These spots often had clearings between bushes, allowing a clear view of the vast valley below. Deputies marked these positions on the scene map because they were places where a person could step closer to the cliff edge than on other trail sections. In addition, investigators also noted trail segments where the path became narrower and ran closer to the mountainside. At such positions, if two people moved at the same time, or if one turned around on the narrow path, the chance of losing balance could increase. Deputies checked the ground surface in these narrow sections to see if there were signs of slipping. During the survey, each position considered to have accident potential was marked on a search map. These records included the distance from the trail to the cliff edge, the slope of the ground, and the surface type in that area. Investigators noted these terrain details in the scene file to aid in assessing the likelihood of an accident in the area. The cliff terrain survey was conducted along the entire trail segment near the direction of travel indicated by the series of footprints previously recorded. To more thoroughly check the areas below, the Ulster County Sheriff's Office decided to deploy an experienced mountain rescue team to access the base of the cliffs. Park rangers familiar with the terrain along with some members of the local rescue team were assigned this task. They brought climbing ropes, anchors, and necessary safety equipment to rappel down the steep rock slopes directly below the trail edge. Access was carried out from points where the terrain allowed securing safety lines to large rocks or sturdy trees on the mountainside. Team members descended one by one down the rock slopes below the cliffs, while other deputies and rangers remained above to observe and maintain communication. Upon reaching lower rock ledges and slopes, the climbing team began inspecting the rock areas directly beneath the points on the trail identified as having accident potential. These areas included protruding rock ledges from the cliff, inclined rock faces, and narrow patches of ground between large boulders. Team members closely examined rock surfaces for signs that a person may have slid or impacted them during a fall. They checked for slide marks on rock surfaces, scratched moss patches, or unusual signs on the thin soil layers between boulders. In addition to inspecting rock surfaces, the climbing team also paid attention to the vegetation growing on the slopes below the cliffs. If a person slid down from above, trees or bushes on the slope could be broken or pulled aside. Team members inspected each bush and small tree in the area below the marked points on the trail. They examined branches for signs of fresh breaks, pulled down leaves, or trees leaning in unusual directions. Such signs could indicate that an object or person had passed through the area during a fall down the mountainside. Beyond bushes, searchers also checked large tree trunks scattered across the slope. If a person slid down from the cliff above, a tree trunk could act as an obstacle, causing them to stop at a lower position on the slope. Team members observed the base and trunk for signs of impact or fresh marks on the bark. After inspecting rock ledges and vegetation, the climbing team continued moving to lower areas where the terrain formed natural rock crevices between large boulders. These crevices varied in depth and in some cases could be hidden from view from above. Team members used lights and direct observation into the crevices to determine if any objects or signs were inside. Some crevices were checked by lowering a person closer for detailed inspection of the interior surfaces, especially where soil, dry leaves, or branches might accumulate. The inspection process was carried out slowly and systematically to ensure every area at the base of the cliffs was carefully observed. Search activities on the mountainside and cliff area were recorded in the scene file, but had not yet provided clear signs of Margaret Whitaker's location. A group of investigators from the Ulster County Sheriff's Office shifted to examining other factors that could clarify details of the trip on September 29, 1948. One of the steps taken was to inspect the vehicle that Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker had used to travel from Albany to the park area. Leonard's car was still parked at the lot near the trailhead, which deputies had previously noted as the starting point for the two when they began their hike. Investigators approached the vehicle and recorded initial information about the car before proceeding with an interior check. They noted the license plate, the car's position in the lot, and its exterior condition for inclusion in the scene file. After completing the exterior observation, deputies began inspecting the vehicle's interior to determine if any items or documents might relate to the two's journey that day. The car doors were opened, and investigators observed the front seats, dashboard, rear seat area, and floor. They checked door compartments, pockets behind seats, and floor areas to see if any personal items belonging to Margaret Whitaker remained in the car. During the interior search, a deputy opened the glove compartment on the passenger side and discovered a paper park map. This map was the type visitors typically received at the entrance area or park ranger station, showing main trails, scenic overlooks, and basic terrain features of the area. Recognizing that the map might provide information about the two's travel plan during the trip, investigators removed the map from the glove compartment for closer examination. The map was unfolded on the car's hood so deputies could view the entire surface. While examining markings on the map, an investigator noticed a pencil mark in the area showing the Gertrude's Nose Trail. This mark was a fairly clear X shape, located near a trail section leading to the cliff area. Deputies continued observing the map to determine if there were any other markings or notes. Apart from this X, the map surface had no additional marks. The position of the X was compared by investigators with the scene map used by search forces in the operation. When comparing the two maps, they noted that the marked point on the car map was near the mountainside and cliff area that search teams had previously surveyed. A deputy recorded the corresponding position of the X on the official search map for inclusion in the investigation file. Investigators also noted details about the map's discovery location in Leonard Whitaker's car interior, including that it was in the glove compartment on the passenger side. An evidence bag was then temporarily sealed and labeled with the collection, time, discovery, location, and identities of the deputies present when the map was found. The park map was brought to the temporary coordination area near the trailhead for investigators to examine in more detail alongside the scene map used during the search. A deputy spread the paper map taken from Leonard's car on a wooden table at the temporary work area, while another investigator placed the official topographic map of the area beside it for easy comparison. The X drawn on the visitor map was closely observed to determine the precise location of the mark relative to terrain features shown on the map. Investigators began comparing the X position with the last known position previously established in the investigation file. On the scene map, the LKP was marked based on statements from hikers who saw Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker on Gertrude's Nose Trail that afternoon on September 29, 1948. When placing the two maps side by side, deputies determined that the X was on the same trail but a certain distance from the LKP toward the trail section near the mountainside. An investigator used a pencil to mark the corresponding position of the X on the official topographic map to record the match between the two maps. An investigator continued asking Leonard about the time period between when he turned back to search for Margaret and when he reached the park ranger station to report her missing. Leonard stated he had searched around the trail area for a short time before returning to the trailhead. These details were carefully recorded in the statement transcript. After completing Leonard's description of events on the trail, deputies began comparing his statement with the investigative timeline constructed from other information sources. This timeline included time points recorded from hikers' statements who saw Margaret and Leonard on the trail, the time Leonard appeared at the park ranger station, and the time he returned to the parking area. Investigators placed the timeline beside Leonard's statement record to check consistency between time points. They asked Leonard to reconfirm the estimated time periods for each stage of the hike, including when the two began walking on the trail and when he realized Margaret was no longer behind him. A deputy marked the time points Leonard provided on the timeline for direct comparison with prior records in the investigation file. The information obtained from Leonard Whitaker's statement along with the traces recorded on the trail led investigators to systematically consider the hypothesis that Margaret Whitaker may have suffered an accident while moving along the Gertrude's Nose Trail. To evaluate this possibility, the Ulster County Sheriff's Office re-examined the terrain areas near the trail section where Margaret was believed to have been walking behind Leonard before disappearing from view. Deputies along with park rangers returned to the trail segments marked on the investigation map to more closely observe the ground surface characteristics and the slope of the mountainside. The inspection focused on positions where the trail narrowed or where the terrain sloped toward the steep drop edge. Investigators walked along the trail and observed the ground surface, paying attention to sections where a thin layer of soil over rock could create a slippery surface. Some spots showed ground covered by dry leaves and a thin moss layer clinging to rock, which led deputies to assess that if a person stepped off the main path, the risk of losing balance could occur. In addition to observing the trail surface, investigators also evaluated the slope of the surrounding terrain in that area. A deputy used a handheld inclinometer to determine the mountainside slope right beside the trail at several points marked in the search file. These measurements showed that in many sections, the mountainside sloped downward at a significant angle, especially at positions near the cliff edge. Park rangers explained that the terrain in this area varied continuously, with some trail segments running close to the steep slope, while others widened and stayed a safer distance from the rock edge. This information was recorded to help investigators identify which areas posed a higher accident risk if a person slipped off the trail. While inspecting trail sections with steep slopes, deputies continued observing the ground surface for signs of sliding or disturbance. Signs such as pulled-down soil, displaced small rocks, or disturbed leaf litter could indicate that a person had lost balance and slid off the trail. Investigators compared these observations with the locations of previously discovered evidence on the trail, including the handkerchief and the series of shoe prints on soft soil. The handkerchief's position right at the trail edge was examined more closely to determine whether the item could have fallen out during a person's slide off the trail. Deputies stood at the spot where the handkerchief had been found and observed the downward slope of the mountainside immediately adjacent. They assessed where the natural slide direction would lead if a person stepped off the trail at that point. Terrain observations showed that from the handkerchief position, the mountainside sloped down through a sparse forest area before leading to lower rock ledges. Investigators continued comparing this downward direction with the position of the previously discovered series of shoe prints on soft soil. The shoe print series indicated that the person leaving the footprints had moved close to the trail edge toward a curved section of the mountainside. A deputy remarked these positions again on the investigation map to identify the connection between the footprints, the handkerchief location, and the high slope terrain points. Deputies also observed the spacing between the footprints to evaluate the person's movement speed. The distance between steps suggested the person was walking normally along the trail edge before the traces ended near the steep slope area. Investigators stood at the final point of the footprint series and observed the surrounding terrain to determine if there were signs of slipping. They checked the ground surface, nearby rocks, and vegetation for disturbance signs. These observations were recorded in the scene notebook for comparison with other areas along the trail. During the accident hypothesis evaluation, deputies continued cross-referencing all terrain factors with the positions of evidence recorded in the investigation file. This allowed them to identify trail segments where a hiker could slide off the path if losing balance while moving near the mountainside edge. This comparison showed that the mark on the visitor map was not at the exact position where Margaret was last seen, but offset toward a trail section near the cliff area. Deputies continued examining details around the X position to identify the terrain in that area. On the topographic map, the trail section at the corresponding X position was near a mountainside area where the path ran close to the cliff edge. Park rangers familiar with the area were consulted to confirm terrain characteristics at that point. They confirmed that the trail section led to an overlook area where visitors sometimes stopped to view the landscape. After determining the corresponding position, investigators marked this area more clearly on the investigation map used for the search operation. A small circle was drawn around the point corresponding to the X, then noted with pencil to distinguish it from previously marked points, such as the LKP and the handkerchief discovery location. Deputies also noted the estimated distance between the LKP and the X position based on the topographic map scale. This distance was calculated to determine whether a hiker on the trail could have moved from the LKP to that position within the time frame established in the day's timeline. In addition to locating the position, investigators continued analyzing trails and surrounding terrain features around the marked point. They observed the map to identify access routes to that position from different directions. A deputy used a pencil to draw trails leading to the X area to determine how search teams could approach it from the trailhead or from previously checked sectors. This allowed investigators to assess whether the area corresponding to the X had been fully checked during the prior search. After comparing the scene map with the visitor map, deputies noted that part of the area around the marked point might lie outside sectors thoroughly swept on the previous search day. This led them to determine that the area corresponding to the X required additional checking. A deputy noted this area in the search plan by marking an additional sector on the investigation map. Park rangers were asked about the terrain characteristics of that area to determine an appropriate approach. Rangers stated that the area was near a rocky slope section with small paths leading down to lower rock ledges. This information was recorded to adjust search team movement plans. Deputies continued observing the map to define the expanded area needing further checking around the X mark. A larger circle was drawn around the marked point to represent the additional search radius based on surrounding terrain. This area included the trail section near the cliffs, slopes below the trail, and forested patches between large boulders. These details were recorded in the scene file along with information about the X mark's discovery position on the map in Leonard Whitaker's car. Leonard was invited to the temporary investigative work area near the trailhead to provide more detailed statements about the entire journey from when the two left Albany until the moment he reported that Margaret Whitaker was no longer behind him on the trail. A deputy began recording Leonard's official statement, documenting each detail related to the trip plan, travel times, and what he recalled happening on Gertrude's Nose Trail. Leonard was asked to describe again the time the two arrived at the park, where they parked, and the trail segment they chose to start hiking. He confirmed that after parking at the trailhead area, the two began walking along the path leading up Gertrude's Nose Trail, a route clearly marked on the park's visitor map. Investigators asked Leonard to describe specifically the hiking route the two had taken, including main trail sections, positions where they stopped, and estimated times for each segment. Leonard stated that the two moved together on the initial part of the trail and did not turn onto any other trail branches during the ascent. A deputy placed the park map on the table and asked Leonard to point out on the map the route the two had taken. Leonard used his finger to trace along Gertrude's Nose Trail, starting from the trailhead area and continuing toward the mountainside. Investigators noted the positions Leonard confirmed they had passed and marked those points on the investigation map to compare with areas previously checked by search teams. After confirming the hiking route, investigators moved to clarify the time when Margaret Whitaker was believed to have been behind Leonard on the trail. Leonard was asked to describe the distance between the two as they moved along the trail. He stated that Margaret usually walked a short distance behind him and sometimes stopped to view the scenery or rest while he continued ahead. Deputies continued asking Leonard at what point he realized Margaret was no longer behind him. Leonard replied that he had turned back after walking a segment and did not see Margaret on the trail. According to his statement, after not seeing his wife behind, he turned back to search the trail section they had just passed before deciding to return to the parking area. Investigators from the Ulster County Sheriff's Office began examining other elements in Margaret Whitaker's file to determine whether any information beyond the scene could help clarify the circumstances of her disappearance. One of the steps taken was to check financial records related to the victim. Deputies contacted the bank where Margaret Whitaker was believed to have maintained a personal account in Albany to verify the status of her account. Initial information showed Margaret had an active bank account used for personal expenses and payments related to her work in ophthalmology. Investigators requested copies of the most recent transactions to determine whether there was any unusual financial activity in the period leading up to September 29, 1948. Upon reviewing the recorded transactions, deputies found no large withdrawals or noteworthy transfers in the days before the trip to Ulster County. The recorded expenditures in the account were mainly routine daily payments related to living expenses and work. The bank account check was documented in the investigation file to establish that prior to the time of disappearance, Margaret Whitaker had maintained normal financial activities. After completing the personal account review, investigators moved on to examine other financial records that might relate to Margaret Whitaker. During information gathering, a deputy discovered that Margaret had a life insurance policy previously signed through an insurance company operating in New York State. Information about this policy was confirmed through family financial records and documents kept at Margaret's residence in Albany. Investigators contacted the insurance company to request a copy of the policy to determine its key terms. The insurance file was sent to the Ulster County Sheriff's Office and reviewed by deputies along with other case-related documents. In the life insurance policy, investigators looked for information on the policy value, payout conditions, and details regarding the designated beneficiary in the event of the insured's death. Deputies noted that this policy had significant financial value by the standards of that era. Next, investigators checked the beneficiary designation in the insurance policy. Records showed that the designated recipient of the insurance benefits in the event of Margaret Whitaker's death was Leonard Whitaker, her husband. This information was recorded in the investigation file, along with other details related to the insurance policy. A deputy noted the policy value and beneficiary name in the case file notebook. Investigators continued reviewing the policy terms to determine payout conditions in the event of death by accident. This was documented because the trail accident hypothesis was still under consideration in the investigation. In addition, deputies checked whether there had been any recent changes to the insurance policy. Records from the insurance company showed the policy retained the same terms and beneficiary since its inception. Investigators recorded this information in the case file as part of the financial data collection process related to Margaret Whitaker. After completing the bank account and life insurance policy review, deputies compiled the collected financial information into the investigation file for comparison with other case facts. The deputies handling the file began reorganizing reports in chronological order to reconstruct a complete sequence of events for September 29. The investigation timeline was recorded on a large diagram sheet placed next to the area topographic map, with key time points filled in based on various previously verified information sources. The first timeline point was when Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker left Albany in the morning to travel toward Ulster County. Investigators continued marking the time the two arrived at the park area and parked at the lot near the trailhead. From there, the timeline moved to the phase when the two began walking on Gertrude's Nose Trail. Subsequent time points were determined from statements by hikers who saw the two on the trail that afternoon. These statements were placed alongside Leonard Whitaker's interview record to confirm consistency between witness information and his account of the hiking route. On the timeline diagram, deputies continued marking the time Leonard Whitaker returned to the trailhead area without Margaret, as well as the time he reached the park ranger station to report that his wife was no longer appearing on the trail. Each time point was clearly noted with its information source, including witness statements, park ranger reports, and notes from Leonard Whitaker's interview session. Once the timeline was fully reconstructed, investigators moved to compile all evidence discovered during the search. An evidence list was created to record each item collected or observed at the scene. This list included the handkerchief found close to the trail edge, the series of shoe prints observed on soft soil near that area, and the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's vehicle interior. Deputies placed the scene map on the table and began marking the discovery location of each piece of evidence to identify connections between them, the trail, and the last known position. The handkerchief was marked at its position close to the trail edge where the search group had discovered it during sector sweeping. The shoe print series was marked at the soft soil area where the footprints had been measured and recorded earlier. The X-mark position on the visitor map was also separately marked on the investigation map to reflect the point recorded from evidence seized in Leonard Whitaker's car. Deputies observed this diagram to determine the relative distances between evidence points and the main trail. The next step in compilation was to review all search results deployed in the area. The search file included reports from teams that checked the main trail, nearby forest sectors, and cliff areas along a mountainside. These reports were placed beside the search map marked during the search grid deployment. Areas that had been checked were marked with specific symbols on the map to show the scope swept throughout the search operation. Reports from the climbing team were also included in the compilation file, documenting the inspection of rock ledges, slopes, and crevices at the base of the cliffs near the trail. Deputies reviewed the directly inspected areas again and cross-referenced them with evidence points marked on the investigation map. The compilation results showed that most of the area around the last known position had been checked, including trail segments running close to the mountainside and forested areas below the cliffs where a person could slide if leaving the path. However, search reports did not record the discovery of a body or any direct traces related to the victim. When all scene data had been placed together, investigators proceeded to evaluate the accident possibility based on the collected information. Deputies re-examined the trail area's terrain characteristics, including mountainside slope, narrow trail sections near the cliff edge, and areas where the ground surface could be slippery. These factors were compared with the handkerchief and shoe print series positions to determine whether those traces fit a scenario in which a hiker slid off the trail. The reconstructed timelines, scene diagram with marked evidence points, and all reports from search teams were placed back on the work table to prepare for file processing according to Ulster County Sheriff's Office administrative procedures. Each investigative document was reviewed once more to ensure all information related to the missing person case handling had been fully recorded in the official file system. Leonard Whitaker's statement record, park ranger interview minutes, and hiker statements were stamped, confirmed, and placed in the same file in proper chronological order. These documents reflected the investigative activity chain starting from receipt of the missing person report, continuing through reconstruction of the September 29, 1948 timeline, and extending to terrain surveys, search deployment, and compilation evaluation of gathered information. The area trail topographic map, along with search diagrams, were carefully folded to place inside a large file folder to avoid damage during long-term storage. Markings for the last known position, handkerchief discovery location, and shoe print series remained intact on the map to preserve scene information recorded during the initial investigation. The mark corresponding to the X on the park map was also retained on the investigation map to reflect the connection between evidence seized from Leonard Whitaker's car and the Dunmore-Diston Cales surveyed area. In addition to document organization, evidence management was completed according to local law enforcement regulations. The handkerchief found on the trail was placed in the separate preservation bag and labeled with identification noting the collection date, discovery location, and officer responsible for evidence collection. The park map seized from the vehicle interior was handled similarly and entered into the sheriff's office evidence log. Information about each piece of evidence was detailed in the management log to ensure all evidence-related data was retained in the official file system. A copy of the evidence collection report was placed in the investigation file folder to maintain linkage between investigative documents and separately stored evidence. When all documents and evidence had been fully classified and recorded, the next step was to complete the initial investigation summary report. This report summarized the entire investigative process, including receipt of the missing person report, collection of witness statements, reconstruction of the event day timeline, and deployment of the search campaign in the trail area and adjacent mountainsides. The report content also noted that multiple search teams had been mobilized to check various sectors around the last seen position, including cliff and slope areas with accident potential. Terrain survey and scene inspection results were presented in the report to reflect the scope of activities performed throughout the investigation. After the summary report was completed, the officer in charge of the case signed confirmation on the document and placed it at the front of the file folder as the overall summary for the entire investigation. The file folder was closed and affixed with the official storage code of the Ulster County Sheriff's Office. This code was entered into the file management log to ensure the document could be retrieved if needed in the future. The file folder was then transferred to the sheriff's office storage area, where completed cases were preserved in metal file cabinets classified by year and case code. The file was placed in the compartment corresponding to 1948, along with other investigative documents stored from the same period. The storage management log was updated to record that the file related to Margaret Whitaker had been transferred to the Ulster County Sheriff's Office archive, along with cabinet and compartment location information for future reference. Investigative documents, scene maps, and search reports were kept in their arranged condition when placed in storage to ensure all data from the 1948 investigation remained fully preserved in the local law enforcement agency's archive system. By 2004, the Sheriff's Office conducted a review program of unsolved old cases to assess whether long-standing files could be re-examined using modern investigative methods. A specialized unit was established to carry out this task, commonly referred to internally as the Cold Case Unit. The group's mission was to review old files, particularly missing persons or unresolved death cases from previous decades. Investigators assigned to this unit began by accessing the Sheriff's Office file storage system to identify cases fitting review criteria. They opened cabinets classified by year, checked lists of archived cases, and noted those recorded as lacking final resolution. Each file removed from storage underwent preliminary review to determine case type, occurrence time, and initial investigation scope. Cases involving missing persons in remote areas or instances where no body was found were often flagged as having review potential. During the review, Cold Case Unit investigators examined numerous files from various years in the mid-20th century, reread initial investigative reports, and noted elements that might warrant reanalysis with modern methods. One goal of this review program was to determine whether old cases contained details not fully analyzed in the investigative context of the time. When checking files from 1948, a thick file folder was pulled from the storage compartment bearing the case code related to Margaret Whitaker. This file contained initial investigative documents, including the missing person report receipt, witness statement records, scene diagrams, and the timeline reconstructed during that year's investigation. A Cold Case Unit investigator began opening each document in the file to reread the content of the original investigation. The summary report was positioned at the front of the file, outlining the search process deployed in the trail area and adjacent mountainsides. Subsequent documents included the scene map with markings for the last known position and evidence discovery points recorded during the search. While rereading these documents, the investigator noted that the case involved a disappearance in rugged terrain where multiple search teams had been deployed, but no body was found. The file also recorded that several pieces of evidence had been collected during the initial investigation, including the handkerchief discovered near the trail edge and the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's vehicle. These details were noted in the Cold Case Unit's notebook as points needing closer examination if the file was selected for reopening. The investigator continued reviewing statement records in the file, including Leonard Whitaker's account of a hiking route on the day Margaret was last seen. These statements were placed beside the 1948 timeline to see how previous investigators had reconstructed the event day sequence. Upon completing the preliminary file review, the Margaret Whitaker file was added to the list of cases potentially eligible for reopening in the Sheriff's Office Cold Case program. The primary focus of the review process was the timeline for September 29, 1948, which had been reconstructed in the initial investigation based on witness statements and park ranger reports. A Cold Case Unit investigator copied all the time points from the original file onto a new timeline chart for easier comparison and analysis. The first recorded point was when Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker left Albany in the morning to travel to the park area. The next point noted when their car was seen at the parking lot near the trailhead. Subsequent time points related to the two appearing on Gertrude's Nose Trail and being seen by several hikers while moving along the path. Investigators marked these points on the new timeline and noted the source of information for each, including statements from witnesses recorded in the 1948 file. Next, the cold case team moved to time points related to Leonard Whitaker returning to the trailhead area alone and reporting to the park ranger that he no longer saw his wife on the trail. These details were recorded on the new timeline to assess whether the sequence of events documented in the original file contained any time gaps that had not been fully analyzed. During the timeline review, investigators compared time points from Leonard Whitaker's statement with those recorded from Hiker's statements. This cross-check aimed to determine the consistency level between the account of the last person with her and independent witnesses appearing in the 1948 file. Alongside the timeline check, the cold case investigation team continued re-examining the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's vehicle during the initial investigation. The map was removed from the evidence preservation bag and spread out on the work table for closer observation. On the map surface, the pencil-drawn X remained clearly visible in an area near Gertrude's nose trail. An investigator placed this map next to the area's topographic map to compare the X position with markings made on the 1948 scene diagram. The X position was relocated on the topographic map and noted in the cold case unit's analysis notebook. The map re-examination focused on determining whether the X coincided with the last known position area recorded in the file, as well as assessing the distance between this marked point and areas checked during the 1948 search campaign. Observations from the map comparison were recorded in the cold case unit's investigative notes for the next evaluation step. The subsequent analysis step focused on re-examining Leonard Whitaker's statement records compiled during the initial investigation. The archive file contained multiple statement records taken during different interview sessions in 1948. Cold case investigators reread each record to identify how Leonard Whitaker described the two's hiking route on the day Margaret was last seen. Descriptions of Margaret walking behind on the trail and Leonard returning to the trailhead were highlighted in the documents for comparison with the timeline reconstructed during the file review. Points in the statement related to positions on the trail and the distance between the two were also noted for cross-reference with the area's topographic map. Each detail in the statement was recorded in the cold case unit's analysis notebook to determine whether this information aligned with facts documented from the scene and witnesses. The reanalysis of the timeline, the park map with the X, and the 1948 statement records led the cold case unit to conclude that reviewing archived documents alone was insufficient to fully evaluate the case details, as many facts in the original file were directly tied to the terrain characteristics of the trail area where Margaret Whitaker was last seen. The investigation team agreed that returning to the incident site was necessary to recheck positions marked in the initial file and compare them with the area's actual conditions after many decades. A field survey trip was planned in coordination with park rangers responsible for Minnewaska State Park Preserve. On an autumn morning in 2004, cold case unit investigators along with a guiding park ranger travel from the park office area to the parking lot near the trailhead where Margaret Whitaker and Leonard Whitaker were recorded as having started their hiking journey in 1948. The parking lot had since been expanded compared to notes in the old file, but the park ranger confirmed that the trailhead position remained close to the area noted in the initial investigation map. The investigation team brought a modern topographic map along with a copy of the 1948 scene map for direct on-site comparison. An investigator placed the two maps side by side on the car hood to determine the approach direction to Gertrude's nose trail from the trailhead. After identifying the trail entrance, the team began moving along the trail in the same direction described in Leonard Whitaker's archive statement. The park ranger led the way, pointing out trail sections that had retained their original structure over the years and those modified for visitor use. While moving along the trail, investigators compared actual terrain with descriptions recorded in the 1948 scene reports. Narrow trail segments running close to the mountainside still existed in the area and were marked on the modern topographic map with steep terrain warning symbols. After traveling a distance on the trail, the team approached the area identified in the file as Margaret Whitaker's last known position. An investigator paused to compare the current position with the LKP marking on the 1948 scene map. The park ranger confirmed that this trail section had remained nearly identical in shape, with one side a steep mountainside and the other a sparse forest area. The team stood at this position to observe the surrounding terrain and note natural features potentially related to descriptions in the initial investigation file. An investigator used the topographic map to determine the trail's direction of travel at this point and noted the distance from there to the nearest cliff edge. These notes were entered into the field survey notebook for comparison with information recorded in the 1948 search reports. The team continued checking the area around the LKP by observing both sides of the trail to determine whether current terrain matched descriptions in the old file. Soft soil sections where footprints had been recorded in the 1948 file no longer retained their original condition due to natural terrain changes over many years. but the overall trail structure still allowed investigators to identify the relative area where those traces had once been found. An investigator stood at the trail edge and looked down the mountainside below to assess the terrain's slope angle in this area. A park ranger pointed out the cliff position a short distance from the trail, matching the area mentioned in the 1948 terrain survey report. Investigators noted this position on the modern map for comparison with archived scene diagrams. While continuing the survey, the team moved slowly along the trail segment around the LKP area to checkpoints offering views down the mountainside or leading to nearby rock surfaces. These observations were recorded in the Cold Case Unit's notebook, along with the relative coordinates of the LKP position on the modern topographic map for further analysis by the team. The original map was placed next to the modern topographic map to precisely identify the area corresponding to the X in the field. An investigator used a map ruler to measure the distance from the trailhead to the marked position, then compared it with Gertrude's nose trail running through the area they had just surveyed. The comparison result showed the X was not directly on the trail but offset a short distance from it toward a mountainside area with numerous rock surfaces. Noting that this marked point was near terrain more complex than the main trail segment, the team decided to move in the direction indicated on the map to check that area on site. The accompanying park ranger pointed out a small side path branching off the main trail toward the mountainside, where terrain transitioned from leaf-covered ground to exposed rock formations. The team left the main trail and proceeded to this area while an investigator continuously compared the actual position with relative coordinates marked on the topographic map. Terrain in this area was steeper than the upper trail segment, with the ground surface interspersed with many large scattered boulders on the mountainside. Some boulders formed natural gaps between rocks, making the area difficult to observe if viewed only from the trail. An investigator paused at a position overlooking the mountainside below and rechecked the map to confirm this area was close to the point marked by the X on the 1948 park map. The distance from this position to the trail was measured by pacing and recorded in the scene notebook. The park ranger explained that this area was rarely accessed by visitors due to uneven terrain and lack of an official path. This drew the team's attention to the possibility that this area may not have been thoroughly checked during the 1948 search campaign, especially if search teams then focused mainly along the trail and primary cliff areas. The team continued moving along the mountainside to more thoroughly survey the area corresponding to the X on the map. During observation, an investigator noticed a narrow gap between two large boulders deeper into the mountainside. Upon approaching, this gap was identified as a natural rock crevice extending downward. The park ranger used a handheld flashlight to shine into the crevice to observe its depth. The light revealed this crevice was deeper than surrounding rock gaps and widened downward at a steep angle. An investigator stood close to the crevice edge to observe the surrounding terrain structure. The two large boulders formed crevice walls positioned close together, creating a narrow opening at the surface but gradually widening farther down. Moss patches and decayed leaf layers clinging to rock surfaces indicated this area had seen little disturbance for a long time. The team used the topographic map to mark this crevice's position relative to the trail and the last known position, recorded in the 1948 file. The estimated distance from the crevice to the LKP point was measured by pacing and recorded in the field survey notebook. An investigator noted that the crevice position was close to the area marked by the X on the park map, though the mark on the original map was only approximate. The park ranger continued observing the crevice structure and pointed out that the terrain in this area could obscure visibility from the upper trail. This made the crevice difficult to detect if searchers observed only from the trail or higher mountainside positions. An investigator bent down to inspect the crevice edge and observe surrounding rock surfaces to determine whether this area showed signs of past disturbance. Notes about the crevice position and the map-marked area prompted the Cold Case Unit investigation team to return to the analysis table to re-examine the entire sequence of events for September 29, 1948 in relation to the recently surveyed actual terrain. The modern topographic map, copy of the park map with the X, and reconstructed timeline from the 1948 file were placed side by side to reconstruct Margaret Whitaker's and Leonard Whitaker's movement route on the day of the incident. An investigator began by measuring the distance from the trailhead to the last known position, using the map distance tool on the topographic map. Gertrude's nose trail from the starting point to the LKP area was determined to have a relatively clear length when compared between the modern map and the old file map. This distance was recorded in the analysis notebook for use in calculating travel time. Next, the team marked the recently discovered crevice position on the map during the field survey and measured the distance from the trail to that area. This distance was noted as only a short segment from the trail, but offset from the main route and obscured by rocky terrain. An investigator noted that if a person left the trail near the LKP area and moved toward the mountainside, they could reach the crevice area in a relatively short time. These distance data were placed alongside the 1948 timeline for comparison with time points recorded in Leonard Whitaker's statement. The original timeline recorded when the two began hiking after reaching the trailhead and time points related to Leonard Whitaker returning to the parking lot alone. To check the reasonableness of this timeline, investigators estimated the time required for a hiker to travel from the trailhead to the LKP area based on measured map distances. A park ranger was asked about average hiker travel speed on Gertrude's Nose Trail and provided information based on years of area management experience. This information was used to estimate the time needed for the two to walk from the trailhead to the LKP area at normal walking pace. After obtaining travel time estimates, the team placed these figures next to time points recorded in Leonard Whitaker's statement. An investigator marked on the new timeline segments where Leonard Whitaker described Margaret walking behind him on the trail. These time points were compared with estimated walking times between points on the trail. The comparison results showed some time intervals in Leonard Whitaker's statement did not fully match actual travel times estimated from terrain distances. An investigator continued checking points related to when Leonard Whitaker returned to the trailhead and reported to the park ranger that he no longer saw his wife on the trail. The distance from the LKP area back to the trailhead was remeasured on the map, and return travel time along the trail was estimated using the same method. When these figures were placed together, the team noted that the time interval between when Leonard Whitaker was reported to have left the LKP area and when he appeared at the trailhead contained points not fully consistent with actual travel time. These findings were recorded in the Cold Case Unit's analysis notebook as part of reconstructing the incident day timeline. An investigator marked time segments on the new timeline to indicate points where Leonard Whitaker's statement differed from travel times calculated from terrain data. The discrepancies between the actual travel times on the trail and the time points in the 1948 statement prompted the Cold Case Unit to expand the review to include witnesses who appeared in the original investigation file. The archived file showed that the park ranger was the first to receive the missing person report from Leonard Whitaker on the afternoon of September 29, 1948, so the investigation team decided to locate this ranger to check whether he still remembered any details not fully recorded in the old reports. From archived personnel records of the New York State Park system, investigators identified the park ranger who had been on duty in the Minnewaska area at the time of the incident. The file indicated that this ranger had retired many years earlier and was now living in a small town not far from Ulster County. A Cold Case Unit investigator first contacted him by phone to explain the purpose of the meeting and then arranged an in-person interview at his home. During the meeting, investigators brought copies of several documents from the 1948 file, including the missing person report receipt and the park map used in the initial search. The conversation began by asking the park ranger to confirm what he remembered about the day Margaret Whitaker was reported missing at the park. The ranger said he still remembered the event quite clearly because it was one of the large-scale search operations that occurred in the area during his time working at the park. He described that on that afternoon, a man came to the ranger station and reported that he could not find his wife on the trail. When asked to confirm, the ranger stated that the man was Leonard Whitaker, who had been hiking with Margaret. An investigator continued asking about details of the initial exchange between Leonard Whitaker and the ranger at the park station. The ranger recalled that Leonard Whitaker appeared anxious and said he had gone back on the trail to search but did not see his wife. However, when investigators probed further about earlier conversations that day, the ranger began to recall another detail he believed was not clearly recorded in the initial report. According to him, before reporting the disappearance in the afternoon, Leonard Whitaker had stopped by the ranger station earlier in the day to ask some questions about the terrain along the trail area. The ranger said Leonard Whitaker had inquired about areas with steep terrain or cliffs near Gertrude's Nose Trail. He remembered that the man was particularly interested in sections where the trail ran close to cliff edges or where rocky mountainside segments branched off the trail. Upon hearing this detail, an investigator opened the park map and asked the ranger if he could point out the area Leonard Whitaker had asked about at that time. The ranger studied the map for a few minutes, then used his finger to indicate an area near the trail segment where cliffs and rocky slopes appeared close together. The position he pointed out was relatively close to the area marked with the X on the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's car in the 1948 file. Investigators noted this detail in the interview notebook and asked more about how Leonard Whitaker had phrased his questions at the time. The ranger said Leonard's questions focused on whether there were any sections along the trail where a person could look down the mountainside or access rock surfaces below the trail. He also recalled Leonard Whitaker asking about the slope of the terrain at certain specific trail segments. These details were carefully recorded in the interview minutes because they directly related to the terrain area the cold case unit had recently surveyed during the return trip to the park. An investigator continued asking the ranger whether he remembered the time of this conversation during the day. The ranger said he believed the exchange took place in the morning or early afternoon before Leonard Whitaker returned to the ranger station to report the disappearance later that afternoon. The new information gathered from the park ranger interview was placed alongside terrain survey notes and the reconstructed timeline from the cold case file review. The cold case unit investigation team gathered in the workroom to analyze the connections between these details and determine whether they could form a reasonable investigative hypothesis. On the work table, the topographic map of the Gertrude's Nose Trail area was spread out along with a copy of the park map bearing the X and notes from the field survey trip. An investigator began by remarking 3 key positions on the map: the last known position recorded in the 1948 file, the crevice location discovered during the 2004 survey, and the area the park ranger said Leonard Whitaker had inquired about regarding terrain before reporting the disappearance. When these 3 points were marked on the same map, the distances between them were measured and noted to identify geographic connections among the positions. The results showed that the crevice area was close to both the LKP position and the area marked with the X on the park map. These facts led the investigation team to consider the possibility that the events on the day Margaret Whitaker disappeared may not have been a random accident on the trail. An investigator placed the new timeline next to the map to re-examine the previously analyzed sequence of time. The time intervals that did not match between Leonard Whitaker's statement and actual trail travel times were highlighted in red on the timeline. Investigators began discussing whether these time gaps could correspond to an action occurring off the trail. When the topographic map was rotated to view from the mountainside direction, an investigator pointed out that the area near the LKP had a trail segment running relatively close to the cliff edge. The park ranger during the prior survey had also confirmed that this trail section lay adjacent to steep terrain and could provide access to rock surfaces below the trail if one left the main path. The team began constructing a hypothesis that Margaret Whitaker may have been pushed off the cliff area near this trail segment. An investigator marked the nearest cliff position to the LKP on the map and noted the terrain slope in that area based on topographic data collected during the field survey. According to the hypothesis under consideration, if a person was pushed off the cliff edge in this area, the body could slide down the mountainside and come to rest at lower points where rocky terrain and trees might obscure visibility from the trail. When this hypothesis was placed alongside the 1948 search results, an investigator noted that the search campaign at the time focused heavily on the main cliff base area in sectors along the trail, but may not have covered all small crevices offset from the primary search lines. The team continued examining the crevice position discovered during the 2004 survey. An investigator marked this crevice on the topographic map and compared its position with the X on the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's car. The distance between these 2 points was measured and noted in the analysis notebook. The results showed the crevice was closer to the marked area on the map than other points on the mountainside. This led investigators to consider the possibility that the crevice could have played a role in concealing a body if a violent incident had occurred near that area. An investigator noted that the crevice structure observed during the survey showed it was deep and narrow, with a smaller opening at the top compared to the space below. This terrain feature could make the crevice difficult to detect from the upper trail or from higher mountainside search positions. The next hypothesis raised was that if a body fell into or was placed in this crevice, it might not have been easily visible during the initial search, especially when search teams primarily checked more accessible areas on the mountainside. The team recorded this hypothesis in the cold case unit's analysis document as a possibility requiring further checking in subsequent investigative steps. The investigative hypotheses constructed from terrain analysis maps and timeline led the cold case unit to move to the step of directly interviewing the only surviving person present at the scene on the day Margaret Whitaker disappeared. The file showed Leonard Whitaker was still living in New York State. so investigators decided to summon him for an official interview regarding the reopened investigation. A formal invitation letter was sent to Leonard Whitaker requesting him to come to the Ulster County Sheriff's Office to discuss details of the 1948 case. On the scheduled day, Leonard Whitaker appeared at the sheriff's office and was escorted to the interview room, where two cold case unit investigators were waiting, with the case file placed on the table. The interview began by confirming Leonard Whitaker's identity and reiterating that the investigation into Margaret Whitaker's disappearance was being reviewed by the cold case unit. An investigator opened the file folder and placed the newly reconstructed timeline on the table as a reference document during questioning. Leonard Whitaker was asked to describe again the hike on September 29, 1948, including leaving Albany, arriving at the park, and starting on Gertrude's Nose Trail. Leonard Whitaker repeated most of the details similar to those recorded in the file decades earlier, stating that he and Margaret began walking on the trail and that Margaret walked behind him for a segment. When asked about the last time he saw Margaret, Leonard Whitaker continued describing that he turned back on the trail and no longer saw her behind him. An investigator placed the topographic map on the table and asked Leonard Whitaker to point out the position on the trail where he believed Margaret had been behind him before disappearing. Leonard Whitaker pointed to an area near the trail segment identified in the file as the last known position. The investigator continued asking about travel times between points on the trail that day. Leonard Whitaker said he believed they had moved at a normal walking pace for hikers on the trail. At this point, the investigator placed the new timeline next to the map and began comparing time points in Leonard Whitaker's statement with calculations of actual distances and travel times previously performed by the cold case unit. An investigator pointed to segments highlighted on the timeline and asked Leonard Whitaker to explain the time interval between when he said Margaret was behind him and when he returned to the trailhead to report her missing. Leonard Whitaker replied that he had gone back to search a segment on the trail before returning to the parking lot. The investigator continued asking about the distance he had searched back and the time he believed that took. While Leonard Whitaker answered, the investigator noted the new time points he provided and placed them next to those recorded in the 1948 file. When these points were compared with actual distances on the topographic map, an investigator pointed out that the time Leonard Whitaker described for moving between points on the trail did not fully align with estimated walking times based on terrain distances. An investigator continued asking Leonard Whitaker whether he had left the trail at any point that day. Leonard Whitaker replied that he had only walked along the main trail and did not recall leaving the path. The investigator recorded this answer and asked additional questions related to the mountainside area near the trail segment where Margaret was last seen. Leonard Whitaker was asked whether he had approached the cliff area or rock surfaces near the trail that day. He replied that he did not recall going down the mountainside and believed his entire time was spent on the main trail. Leonard Whitaker's answers during the interview were fully recorded in the minutes and immediately placed alongside the analysis documents the cold case unit had prepared before summoning him. On the interview table, the topographic map of the Minnewaska State Park preserve area, copy of the park map with the X terrain survey diagram, and newly reconstructed timeline were spread out to facilitate cross-referencing each detail in Leonard Whitaker's statement. An investigator began by placing the park map in front of Leonard Whitaker and asking him to confirm that this was the type of visitor map typically distributed at the trailhead area in the late cold 1940s. Leonard Whitaker looked at the map and confirmed it was similar to the type issued at the park at that time. The investigator continued pointing to the X drawn on the map and asked Leonard Whitaker whether he knew when this mark had been made. Leonard Whitaker replied that he did not recall marking any position on the map. At this point, an investigator placed a modern topographic map next to the map with the X and pointed out the corresponding position of the mark in the field. That position was near the rocky mountainside area and crevice the cold case unit had surveyed during the return trip to the park. The investigator explained that during the 2004 field survey, the area corresponding to the X had been identified as offset from the main trail and near a deep crevice below the mountainside. Leonard Whitaker looked at the map but offered no clear explanation for the mark. An investigator continued shifting to the topographic map and used a pen to mark Gertrude's Nose Trail from the trailhead to the last known position area recorded in the 1948 file. He then marked the crevice position and measured the distance from the trail to that area. The distance figures were noted directly on the map to illustrate a possible movement route if a person left the trail near the LKP area. The investigator explained that the distance from the trail to the crevice area was short enough for a person to reach it in a relatively brief time if departing the path. Leonard Whitaker was asked whether he had ever left the trail in that area on the day Margaret Whitaker disappeared. He repeated that he did not recall leaving the trail and believed his entire time was spent on the main trail. The interview continued with cross-referencing actual terrain with descriptions in Leonard Whitaker's statement. An investigator placed photographs taken of the mountainside and crevice area during the 2004 survey on the table to illustrate the terrain structure in the area corresponding to the X on the map. The photographs showed a deep crevice between two large boulders, with a narrow opening at the top and an expanding space below down the mountainside. The investigator asked Leonard Whitaker whether he had ever seen this area during the hike. Leonard Whitaker replied that he did not recall going down to that rocky area. An investigator then returned to the new timeline reconstructed during the cold case file analysis. On this timeline, time points from Leonard Whitaker's 1948 statement had been placed next to estimated travel times based on actual trail distances. The investigator pointed to a time segment between when Leonard Whitaker said Margaret was behind him and when he returned to the trailhead to report her missing. He explained that the time Leonard Whitaker described for returning to search on the trail did not match actual travel time between points on the trail. Leonard Whitaker was asked whether he could explain why this time interval was longer than the time needed to travel on the trail. Leonard Whitaker replied that he had returned to search for Margaret on the trail for a period before going back to the parking lot. The investigator recorded this answer and continued pointing out that if Leonard Whitaker had only moved along the trail as described, the total travel time between points would not align with time points recorded in the 1948 reports. These details were documented in the interview minutes, along with the maps and materials used during the cross-referencing. The continuous cross-referencing between the maps, actual terrain, and timeline caused a noticeable shift in the atmosphere in the interview room as investigators pressed for more detailed answers about the unexplained time gaps in Leonard Whitaker's statement. On the table in front of him remained the topographic map of the Gertrude's Nose Trail area, with key points marked: the trailhead, the last known position, the cliff area, and the crevice location offset from the trail. An investigator used a pen to trace along the trail route and restated the path Leonard Whitaker had described in his initial 1948 statement, then paused at the area near the cliff edge where Margaret Whitaker was last seen. The investigator explained that the distances between points on the trail had been recalculated and the actual travel times did not align with the time points Leonard Whitaker had provided. Another investigator placed the park map bearing the X in front of Leonard Whitaker and reiterated that the marked position was near the crevice area discovered by the cold case unit during the field survey. Leonard Whitaker remained silent for several seconds while looking at the map. The investigator continued presenting that this area lay outside the main search lines of the 1948 campaign and that the crevice's terrain made it difficult to detect from above the trail. He then pointed to a spot on the map where the cliff ran close to the trail and asked Leonard Whitaker whether he was certain he had never left the trail in that area. Leonard Whitaker initially repeated that he did not recall leaving the trail. But as the investigator pressed further about the time interval between when he said Margaret was behind him and when he returned to the trailhead, his responses began to slow. The investigator continued cross-referencing the collected facts, terrain distances, the X-mark position on the map, and the park ranger's statement that Leonard Whitaker had inquired about cliff areas on the day of the incident. An investigator stated that these details indicated Leonard Whitaker had prior knowledge of the area's terrain before Margaret Whitaker disappeared. Leonard Whitaker looked down at the table while the investigator asked more direct questions about what had happened on the trail on September 29, 1948. He was asked whether there had been any argument between him and Margaret while they were on the trail. After a prolonged silence, Leonard Whitaker said that the two had stopped near a trail segment with a view down the mountainside below. He admitted that an argument had occurred in that area. The investigator asked him to describe more clearly what happened next. Leonard Whitaker said that during the argument, Margaret Whitaker stood near the cliff edge with her back to the mountainside. He said that in that moment, he pushed her. Leonard Whitaker stated that Margaret Whitaker lost balance and fell off the cliff edge down the mountainside below. An investigator recorded every word he said in the interview minutes, while the other investigator continued asking about what happened after Margaret Whitaker fell down the mountainside. Leonard Whitaker said that he looked down from the cliff edge, but could not clearly see where she landed due to rocky terrain and trees obstructing the view. He said that afterward he left the cliff edge and returned to the trail. The investigator asked Leonard Whitaker whether he went down the mountainside to where Margaret Whitaker had fallen. Leonard Whitaker said that he went down a segment of the mountainside to check the area below. He described that upon reaching the rocky area beneath the cliff, he saw Margaret Whitaker's body lying near a crevice between large boulders. Leonard Whitaker said that he dragged her body to the edge of the crevice and pushed the body into the gap between the rocks. He said that the crevice was deep and dark and that when he looked down, he could no longer clearly see the body. The investigator continued asking Leonard Whitaker what happened next. Leonard Whitaker said that he returned to the trail, walked back to the trailhead, and then went to the park ranger station to report that he could not find his wife on the trail. The details recorded in Leonard Whitaker's confession were fully documented by the cold case unit investigators in the interview minutes and immediately moved to the field verification step to check the accuracy of the information he had just provided. During the subsequent exchange, Leonard Whitaker was asked whether he could re-identify the crevice location where he said he had placed Margaret Whitaker's body after she fell from the cliff. Leonard Whitaker replied that he believed he could still recognize the area if he returned to the park. A field verification plan was quickly arranged in coordination with the Ulster County Sheriff's Office, the cold case unit, and park rangers responsible for Minnewaska State Park Preserve. On the designated day, a group of investigators, along with law enforcement personnel, brought Leonard Whitaker to the park area to re-identify the location he had described in his confession. At the parking lot near the trailhead, Leonard Whitaker was asked to indicate the direction he and Margaret Whitaker had traveled on September 29, 1948. He pointed toward the entrance to Gertrude's Nose Trail and said that the two had started their hike from that area. Investigators recorded Leonard Whitaker's description in the scene minutes, while a park ranger led the entire group along the trail toward the last known position area identified in the file. Leonard Whitaker walked ahead with one investigator, while the other team members followed to take notes and mark positions on the topographic map. As they approached the trail segment where the terrain began running close to the mountainside, Leonard Whitaker stopped and said this was the area where he and Margaret Whitaker had paused before the argument he described in the interview. An investigator marked this position on the topographic map for comparison with the last known position recorded in the 1948 file. Leonard Whitaker then pointed toward the cliff edge near the trail and said that Margaret Whitaker had stood near that area while the two were talking. Investigators noted this position and continued asking Leonard Whitaker to indicate the path he said he took down the mountainside after Margaret Whitaker fell from the cliff. Leonard Whitaker left the trail and moved down the mountainside in a direction offset from the main path. The park ranger warned that the terrain in this area was steep, with many slippery rock surfaces, so the group moved slowly to ensure safety. Leonard Whitaker stopped at a position where two large boulders lay close together and pointed down to a narrow gap between the rocks. He said this was the area where he had seen Margaret Whitaker's body after she fell down the mountainside. An investigator bent down to observe the crevice while another shone a flashlight into the gap between the boulders. Leonard Whitaker continued describing that he had dragged Margaret Whitaker's body to the edge of the crevice and then pushed the body into the space inside. Investigators recorded this description in the scene minutes and marked the crevice position on the topographic map. A park ranger confirmed that this position was near the area previously noted by the cold case unit during their earlier survey when they discovered a deep crevice offset from the main trail. Investigators continued measuring the distance from the crevice to the trail above to record scene data. The distance was noted in the minutes and compared with estimates made during prior map analysis. Leonard Whitaker was asked more about how he accessed this area in 1948. He said that after Margaret Whitaker fell down the mountainside, he had gone down a natural sloping path between the rocks to reach the place where she lay. He continued saying that when he saw the crevice, he thought it was a place that could conceal the body from view if searchers came into the area. The crevice position just identified by Leonard Whitaker during the field verification was marked with temporary stakes to prepare for a detailed forensic survey in this area. A crime scene investigation team was mobilized to Minnewaska State Park Preserve, along with forensic experts to examine the crevice that Leonard Whitaker said he used to conceal Margaret Whitaker's body in 1948. The surrounding area was cordoned off with scene tape to prevent unauthorized access throughout the operation. An investigator stood at the crevice edge while a forensic expert used a powerful light to observe the interior space between the two large boulders. The light shining down revealed that the crevice gradually widened as it went deeper, with layers of decayed leaves, soil, and small rock fragments accumulated over many years. Due to the crevice's depth, a technical team used safety ropes and climbing gear to access the bottom of the space. A survey team member was lowered into the crevice while investigators above observed and documented the entire process with scene cameras. Upon reaching the lower area in the crevice, the surveyor began examining the accumulated soil and decayed leaf layer at the bottom. After several minutes of inspection, he reported that there were bone structures beneath the natural material layer. This information was relayed upward, and another forensic expert was lowered into the crevice to assist with more detailed examination. Investigators above prepared evidence bags and sample collection tools while awaiting the report from the team below. After the decayed leaves and soil were carefully moved aside, bone fragments became clearly visible under the light. The forensic expert confirmed that these bone fragments had shapes consistent with human bones. This information was recorded in the scene minutes, and a forensic photographer took images from above before proceeding with bone sample recovery. Forensic experts began collecting each bone fragment according to standard procedure, placing them into separate labeled preservation bags with the recovery position and time. During the continued examination of the crevice bottom area, a survey team member discovered additional items mixed in the soil and decayed leaf layer. These items were carefully observed before being touched to avoid altering their original positions. One of the items discovered was a small metal frame shaped like eyeglass rims. Investigators above noted this item's position on the scene diagram before the forensic expert placed it into an evidence bag. Another item found near the bone area was a small metal piece attached to the remains of a clasp. The forensic expert determined that this item could be part of a bag or personal item once carried. These items were collected and placed into separate preservation bags for transfer to the lab. While evidence recovery continued, investigators on the surface recorded all discovery positions on the scene map to create a detailed diagram of the crevice. Each bone fragment and personal item was numbered corresponding to its recovery position to ensure every scene detail was preserved in the investigation file. Once bone sample recovery was complete, they were hoisted out of the crevice using ropes and placed into specialized preservation boxes. These boxes were sealed and labeled according to Ulster County Sheriff's Office evidence management procedures. The personal items found with the remains were also entered into the evidence log and placed in separate preservation bags. The recovery of remains and personal items from the crevice bottom was fully documented in the scene minutes, and all evidence was transferred to the forensic lab for subsequent scientific examination. While forensic experts began the analysis process, cold case unit investigators compiled all facts gathered during the reopened investigation. The file now included Leonard Whitaker's confession from the interview, the scene identification minutes when he led investigators to the crevice in the park, the topographic map with marked positions, as well as the remains recovery report and personal item list from that area. All these documents were organized into a complete investigation file to serve the next legal processing step. After reviewing the collected evidence, the Ulster County Sheriff's Office proceeded with procedures to arrest Leonard Whitaker in connection with Margaret Whitaker's death. An official arrest warrant was prepared based on evidence in the file, including Leonard Whitaker's confession and the identification of the remains' location according to his statement. Once the arrest warrant was approved, investigators contacted Leonard Whitaker to inform him that he needed to report to the Ulster County Sheriff's Office for further case processing. When Leonard Whitaker appeared at the sheriff's office, investigators informed him that he was under arrest in connection with Margaret Whitaker's death. His Miranda rights were read to him in accordance with legal requirements before he was taken to the sheriff's office holding area. The arrest report was prepared immediately afterward, clearly recording the time and place of Leonard Whitaker's arrest as well as the legal grounds for the action. During post-arrest administrative processing, Leonard Whitaker was photographed for identification and fingerprinted according to standard procedures applied to all arrests by local law enforcement. This identification information was entered into the case file along with investigative documents collected throughout the cold case review. Parallel to processing Leonard Whitaker at the sheriff's office, investigators completed the comprehensive investigation report for transfer to the prosecutor's office. This report summarized the entire case progression, beginning with Margaret Whitaker being reported missing on September 29, 1948 at Minnewaska State Park Preserve, followed by the search and initial investigation activities that year, and then the file review by the Ulster County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit in 2004. The report also detailed the investigative steps taken during the case reopening, including reanalysis of the incident day timeline, resurvey of the trail area seen, discovery of the crevice near the position marked on the park map, and Leonard Whitaker's confession during the interview. In addition, the report noted that Leonard Whitaker had led investigators to the exact crevice location where remains were found during the scene examination. All related documents, including interview minutes, scene maps, terrain survey reports, remains recovery report, and seized evidence list, were attached to the investigation file for transfer to the Ulster County District Attorney's Office. This file transfer marked the shift from the law enforcement investigation phase to the prosecution phase under New York State criminal justice procedures. The investigation file, after being transferred to the Ulster County District Attorney's Office, was reviewed by prosecutors to prepare for prosecution in New York State Court. Documents collected by the cold case unit during the case reopening were reorganized by evidence structure to serve the legal proceedings, including the initial 1948 investigation report, the 2004 file review report, Leonard Whitaker's interview minutes, documentation of him leading investigators to the crevice in the park, along with the forensic report on remains and personal items recovered at the scene. Once prosecutors completed file preparation, the case was brought to trial in a New York State court, with Leonard Whitaker as the defendant in the matter concerning Margaret Whitaker's death. On the opening day of the trial, Leonard Whitaker was brought into the courtroom under the supervision of court security police. The prosecutor representing New York State presented to the court that the case originated from a missing person incident at Minnewaska State Park Preserve on September 29, 1948. When Margaret Whitaker was reported missing during a hike with her husband Leonard Whitaker. The prosecutor continued presenting that the initial investigation at the time did not locate the victim's body, leading to the file being archived for decades until the Ulster County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reviewed the case in 2004. Before the jury, the prosecutor sequentially presented evidence collected during the reopened investigation. A cold case unit investigator was called as a witness to describe how the team had reviewed the 1948 file, reanalyzed the incident day timeline, and conducted field surveys in the trail area of the park. This witness testified that during terrain survey, investigators discovered a crevice offset from Gertrude's Nose Trail, near the area marked with an X on the park map seized from Leonard Whitaker's car in the initial investigation. The prosecutor then presented to the court that during the interview conducted by the cold case unit, Leonard Whitaker had admitted pushing Margaret Whitaker off the cliff during an argument on the trail. Leonard Whitaker's confession transcript was read in court as part of the evidence file. Next, another investigator was called as a witness to describe how Leonard Whitaker had led police to the crevice area in Minnewaska State Park Preserve and precisely indicated the spot where he said he placed Margaret Whitaker's body inside the gap between boulders. The prosecutor presented that when investigators and forensic experts examined that area, they discovered human bone fragments along with some personal items at the crevice bottom. A forensic expert was called to explain to the jury the remains recovery process and how samples were analyzed in the lab. This witness described that the bone fragments found in the crevice had structures consistent with a human skeleton and were recovered according to standard forensic procedures. The prosecutor continued presenting that the remains discovery location matched the area Leonard Whitaker had indicated during the scene verification with investigators. In their closing argument, the prosecutor emphasized that the chain of evidence in the case included the defendant's confession, the identification of the body concealment location according to his statement, and the recovery of remains at that exact location in the park. After the prosecutor completed their presentation, the defense attorney representing Leonard Whitaker presented their argument to the jury. The defense attorney questioned the very long time that had passed between Margaret Whitaker's disappearance and the case being brought to trial, while also mentioning difficulties in accurately reconstructing events from many decades earlier. However, during witness cross-examination, the defense attorney also had to confront the investigative documents and confession recorded in the case file. Cold case unit investigators continued presenting details about the file review process, scene survey, and cross-referencing of topographic maps with time points in Leonard Whitaker's statement. After both sides completed arguments and witness examinations, the presiding judge instructed the jury on legal rules regarding evidence consideration and reaching a verdict. The jury then retired to deliberate on the case based on evidence presented in court. After a period of deliberation, jury members returned to the courtroom to announce their verdict. The jury foreperson stood and stated that the jury had reached a unanimous decision in the case. According to the verdict announced in court, Leonard Whitaker was found guilty of causing Margaret Whitaker's death. This verdict was entered into the trial record and confirmed by the judge according to New York State judicial procedures. Leonard Whitaker stood before the court as the judge pronounced sentence based on the jury's verdict and applicable laws for the case. The sentence was recorded in the court file as the final outcome of the case concerning Margaret Whitaker's death, concluding an investigation file that began in 1948 and was only resolved decades later when the Cold Case Unit reopened the matter. If you want to continue following cold cases solved after many decades, like the story of Margaret Whitaker, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next surprising investigation files. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video with another mysterious case waiting to be revealed.